2011 has been called the year of the protest as we watched demonstrations spring up around the globe, including right here in cities large and small across the United States. As we begin this new year, I wanted to look at where the Occupy movement has been and maybe where it's headed in 2012. I'm Ann Marie Spatharakis. Thank you for joining us today in the studio. My guest is Tom Sgouros, a freelance writer, policy researcher, and engineer. You can read his columns on golocalprov.com, and he's a frequent guest on Rhode Island PBS's A Lively Experiment, which is where we first met. I'm delighted to have him on the show today. Tom, welcome.
Thanks very much.
Time magazine, as you know, named the protester the person of the year. What are your thoughts on the movement, and will it continue to grow in 2012?
I mean, it's all going to depend on what country you're talking about. But if you're talking about this country, I think that none of the forces that brought the Occupy protest to the head, that brought people out into the streets and into the parks in fall and September and October, none of those forces have gone away. Nothing has changed. The things that push people out into the streets then are going to be just as apparent in the spring, maybe more so than they were last fall. And so I don't expect them to go away. In fact, I expect them to find other ways to make their voices heard. I expect them to to come up with other, with ways to address the more specific manifestations of their general complaint that the table is really tilted against people who work for a living in America today. And it's tilted in favor of the people who've got a lot of money. And until that changes, I can't see how the forces that brought people to their feet are really going to go away.
One of the criticisms of the movement is that it isn't focused enough and that they aren't asking for anything.
I think it's sort of a misleading kind of a thing. We live in a world that asks questions that demand to be answered by an essay, but we're all being forced into a multiple choice test, into a true-false test even. I mean, do you prefer this candidate or this candidate? So what happens when you realize that you understand how thoroughly ordinary people are getting shafted in this country? What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to write to your congressman, write a letter to the editor. I mean, there's really not much you can do. And so when an opportunity to speak out comes by, and when there's an opportunity to join with a wide variety of people who feel the same way about a number of different issues, of course you leap on it. That doesn't mean that every person in that movement feels exactly the same way about what the list of priorities ought to be. But it does mean that everybody in the movement is pretty much on the same page. I've spent a lot of time talking to people at the Occupy Providence, and I spent a little time in Wall Street in the fall. And I wouldn't say that people are diffuse. I mean, that's completely not true. What is true is that people don't have a clear agenda about what to do first. But that's a question of tactics, not a question of the critique of what's the matter. And ultimately, I'd put it back on the people who are in office. I mean, they're the ones who are supposed to be listening to the voices of the people and bonding accordingly. And here are people speaking. So listen, do something. Actually, I was just encouraged to read that Spencer Backus, who's a Republican member of the Senate, is convening hearings to talk about the Securities and Exchange Commission's practice of allowing wrongdoing by banks and corporations to be brushed aside. The SEC typically will allow people to pay a fine but not have to admit any kind of wrongdoing, which leaves basically criminals unpunished. And the fact that a Republican member of the Senate is convening hearings about that practice, talking about how this is a way that corporations, banks, and big corporations avoid responsibility for their actions, I thought that was pretty encouraging. And I have to think that, at least in part, it's an outgrowth of the kind of pressure that the Occupy movement has created.
Do you think the protests are enough? I mean, during the civil rights movement, there was real civil disobedience. And to tell you the truth, this movement almost seems too polite to affect the kind of systemic change that they claim to want. I
mean, I think the lesson of the civil rights movement is that you can be disruptive to the system in a peaceful way. And, to my pleasure, that's a widely shared opinion by the people at the Occupy protests. I think that I think that I think that it is still a form of confrontation, and that it is still something that that cities and that city governments and others in power have to pay attention to. I think I would disagree that that it has to be violent, or there has to be some kind of incident to make people pay attention. Certainly an incident is a way to attract attention, but it's not always what you want. It's not always the kind of attention that you want. I mean, in this case, people have been out there for months peacefully, every day reaffirming their commitment to the causes that they believe in by staying out there. And that's something that gets the attention of people who are who have the power to make decisions that affect the way we conduct our business. Whether they can affect the kind of reshaping of society that they hope. That's a bigger question. That's one of those things where I have to look around and say, well, a lot of them are younger than me. And so they actually do have a pretty good shot at reshaping society, because eventually they are going to be the old ones. Things I think will be different then. But I'm encouraged by what I see there. I'm not, and I don't think that they're on the wrong track by the tactics that they've chosen so far.
I've heard you say that where news is concerned, that there is a danger of speaking in generalities, whether it's in taxes or pensions or what have you. So, if you could name 3 things that, if these things changed, would satisfy the movement. Okay, we did what we came here to do and now we're all going home. What specifically would those be?
Well, let me be clear about what the danger is in discussing generalities. A point that I've made in the past is that it's always dangerous to discuss taxes in general, because taxes are not a general thing. Some taxes fall more heavily on this group of people, some taxes fall more heavily on that group of people. In this country, nationally, I'm talking now, over the last 30 years, we've seen a de-emphasis on the income taxes, which are the progressive sources of taxation, and an increased emphasis on less progressive taxes, like in 1986 when we bumped up the Social Security taxes by quite a lot. Those are ways to shift the burden from one tax to another, and thereby shift the burden of taxation from one group of people, from rich people, to less rich people. So that's the risk in discussing subjects like taxes in general terms. But that's a different thing than the sort of general critique that the Occupy guys have of society, which is more that what they're saying is that in case after case, the table is tilted in favor of the rich. The taxation example that I just gave you is one decent example. Within those questions of taxation, there's a bunch of smaller pieces too. For example, the carried interest rule, which says that hedge fund managers, people who earn their living by commissions on big investment funds, are allowed to treat those commissions as capital gains and thereby get it taxed at a lower rate, as opposed to the salary, which is, somebody who sells a car and gets a commission on that car, they have to count that as salary and it gets taxed as regular income. But these people who earn a commission on the sale of stocks and bonds don't. They get to count it as capital gains and it gets taxed at a lower rate. So there's a specific thing. There's a specific way in which people who are very wealthy have been able to game the system to make the rules better for them. For other examples, you really only have to look as far as Wall Street, where Occupy Wall Street, where the Occupy movement started. Wall Street, I think what people don't really get about a lot of what the banks did in 2007, 2008, and before, a lot of it was actual fraud. Actual out and out crime. People are losing their houses now because of bank fraud. Jefferson County, Alabama, is broke essentially because Goldman Sachs gave Jefferson County executive. Essentially, what they did was they gave Jefferson County a credit card, and then they bribed Jefferson County executives to overuse the credit card. That's as simple as it gets. And, I mean, there's actual bribery involved, there's actual fraud, there's actual misrepresentations involved. But somehow, Goldman Sachs is not held to account for these misdeeds. The taxpayers in Jefferson County are the ones who have to cough up the money. I mean, stuff like that is nuts. Similarly, Countrywide Mortgage. Turns out that, I think I read that something around 90% of the loans that Countrywide had put out there were no documentation loans, liar loans. They're loans that they did not audit the income claims of the people making the loans. This is a place where fraud is just rife, and yet there are not any Countrywide executives in jail, right? There are just the most modest kinds of fines even considered. Bank of America now owns Merrill Lynch. Bank of America a couple of weeks ago managed to move a ton of Merrill Lynch liabilities into its federally guaranteed Bank of America side, which meant that all these things that all these investments that Bank of America was on the hook for, now taxpayers are on the hook for. I mean, these are things that are wrong. They're just out and out wrong, and more credit to the people who have taken to the streets to point them out, because it seems that the Justice Department is not doing it.
So is it that there were laws that were actually broken and penalties that were either ignored, or the penalties maybe were so minor that they were essentially inconsequential to the companies, or were there no laws in place at all?
Sometimes there aren't even fines considered. I mean, the foreclosure fraud stuff is a really interesting example of this. One of the really cool things about, one of the tragedies of government is that government that works disappears, right? The stuff that is a complete raging success, you never hear about, right? There's no scandals in the National Weather Service. They just continue telling us when the hurricanes are coming, and we deal with it, and everybody's happy. When it's when government goes wrong, when FEMA can't handle a hurricane that comes to New Orleans, then we hear about it. But what that means is that nobody realizes how much of government actually works. Well, one of the big examples of how government actually works is the Legion. Hundreds of thousands of deed registry clerks all across the country are all taking care of land records. I mean, this sounds kind of dumb and sort of petty, but there are a legion of a couple 100,000 people in land record offices all across the country, and what it means is that you can go to any county, any town in America, in the whole country, and you can pick a property, and you can find who owns that property, you can find who owned it before, and who owned it before that, and you can trace it all the way back to when we stole it from the Indians, and you can do that anywhere, and that's a really remarkable achievement. I mean, other countries don't have that. And this is how we protect property rights here. The people who are really concerned about property rights, it seems to me, often give short shrift to the government function that does the protection for them. But anyway, so we've got this fabulous system of protecting property rights. Well, the problem is that it's a little onerous for banks that want to slice and dice mortgages and resell them into lots of different securities. So the banks came up with a great solution to deal with these deed registry problems, and the solution that they came up with was that they would just ignore the laws. And so they did. They ignored the laws, and they created their own registry, the Mortgage Electronic Registry Service, MERS, and they just announced that they would use MERS instead of the Register of Deeds in Providence and Pawtucket and Woonsocket and Westerly and those places. They just said, "Oh, we'll use our registry instead." There was no enabling statute in Congress, in the legislature in Rhode Island. There was no city council resolutions allowed them to do that. They just did it. And having done it, that's crime enough. Having done it, they didn't maintain their own registry. A friend of mine who's a title examiner tells me about in 2006 and 2007, he had to report to these. He had to do research in these warehouses in Boston, and he told me about hundreds of yards of utility shelves filled with file boxes that was the inbox for deeds that were supposed to be entered into this electronic registry. And it just never happened. So what happened was that not only did the banks just decide to ignore the existing deed registry laws, they also didn't maintain their own registry. And so what that means now is that it essentially means that they vandalized this system that we had. And so now there are millions of properties all across the country where you cannot trace the title anymore, which means that there's millions of people who cannot prove that they own their house anymore. There's, millions of banks that can't prove, or millions of properties where the bank can't prove that they own a property that they want to foreclose on. And it's a huge mess. And what it means is that it makes it much harder for us to get out of the foreclosure crisis. It makes it much cloudier who owns what. And because of that, it traps people in houses because now they can't sell them because a title insurance company is going to come in and they're going to do the title search and they're not going to find anything. So here's a case where there's where the banks just ignored laws and not only made a mess at it, but where are the penalties that they're going to suffer? I mean, they're nowhere. The only thing that's out there now is that there's this 50-state agreement being negotiated with the I think it's the Attorney General in Indiana who is the lead negotiator on it. And currently it looks like the banks are going to pay about $20 billion, which sounds like a lot of money, but JP Morgan's bonus pool was $10 billion last year. So it's not actually that much money. But basically the proposed settlement is that they'll be allowed to pay $20 billion and just wash their hands of the whole thing, be protected against suits everywhere. The Attorney General in New York has opted out of the problem. The Attorney General in Massachusetts, Martha Coakley, has also decided independently to sue a bunch of the banks over it. So it's in some flux. Our Attorney General in Rhode Island says he's monitoring the situation. I mean, we have to ask ourselves: are we a nation of laws or not? And if we are, then do the laws that are on the books, do they actually mean anything? And if they do, then let's do something about them. And when I find that I'm doing some research into some law or another, it turns out that it was enacted originally for some reason. Now, the reason might be past. The reason, might now be obsolete. The law might have been rendered obsolete by some changes in society or changes in technology or something like that. But the laws were generally enacted for a reason. An ideal example of that is insurance regulation. The insurance is regulated by each state, largely because the federal government wasn't very big at the time when it became perfectly clear to everybody that insurance companies needed to be regulated. And so there are 50 departments of insurance regulation across the country. And what they're there for is to prevent the kind of insurance regulation that was endemic in the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century, which was people selling insurance policies that meant nothing. They would take your premium money and they would invest it in something, and when something went wrong with you, they would not have the resources to pay you. They would invest it in something and run off with it or something. There were 100 different ways that this happened. I'm going to forget the exact statistic, but when Boston burned down, or when Chicago burned down in the 1870s, somewhere around something slightly under 50% of the insurance policies actually paid off. It was in order to make insurance into something useful to people that insurance regulation was created. And that's why it was there. That's why it exists. And how we know that motivation was not rendered obsolete is that half of what brought down Wall Street in 2007 and 2008 was insurance policies. The insurance policies written by investment banks that didn't have the wherewithal to back them up. They called them credit default swaps or other exotic names that kind of hid what they were at root, but basically what they were was insurance policies. But without the margin requirements and the capital requirements that are necessary to make sure that the company who writes the policy can actually pay it off, the insurance fraud was endemic, and companies wrote far more policies than they could pay off. And so when the crash came, they couldn't pay them off. That's why I think I wrote somewhere a couple of years ago that the only real growth industry is securities law, because so many of these contracts were, it's going to take years to unwind them all.
What role do you think the lobby industry has played in all of this, and is that an area that the movement is concerned with?
Oh, sure. Well, the fact is that laws were made to benefit the organizations that had the money to pay for those laws, to pay for the lobbying and to pay for making their voice the loudest and most prominent on that subject. And so, if we're talking again about the Occupy movement, that addressing the nexus between money and laws made to provide comfort to the owners of that money. But money in politics is it's a hard knot to solve. Problem to solve, hard knot to untie. There's a lot of strands to it. The Supreme Court is going out of its way to make it harder to solve it, at the same time that people are demanding that it be easier. The Supreme Court has went and made a completely gratuitous decision in the Citizens United case. So this year in presidential politics, there are essentially no campaign finance limits anymore. So the movement is pushing one way, at the same time the Supreme Court is pushing another way. So any kind of progress that happens in the near future is going to be halting at best. But yeah, those are things that people are certainly going to try to address.
If you are just joining us today, my guest is freelance writer and policy researcher Tom Sgouros. We've been talking about the Occupy Wall Street movement. Please stay with us as we continue our conversation after this short break. I'm Ann Marie Spatharakis. Thank you for joining us today in the studio. Welcome back to the studio. I'm Ann Marie Spatharakis. My guest today is Tom Sgouros. He is a policy researcher and reporter. You can read his articles on golocalprov.com. Tom, you write a lot about social issues, and I'm wondering if you've always been passionate about that, or when did you find that those were the sort of things that were important to you as a writer, and have you always been socially minded and compelled to talk about certain issues?
I can't remember a particular awakening, or if that's what you're saying. I think my discussions when I was young, discussions at home were of the fairly opinionated sort. So I can't remember a moment when I thought, oh, this is something really important to me. I can remember the slow sort of process of realizing that a lot of the radicals whose opinions are so easy to discard really had a point.
Such as?
Let's see. I helped. I was the sound guy on a documentary film crew once, and I got to listen to a whole week of testimony in a trial of anti-CIA protesters This is in 1987, I think, in Northampton. And a bunch of protesters had occupied the administration building at UMass in protest of the CIA. And sort of remarkably, the trial judge on their trespassing trial had allowed them to put up a necessity defense, which meant that they were allowed to call witnesses about the CIA, which was kind of cool. So they called in all these ex-CIA agents, and they called in foreign heads of state, and they called in people to lecture about international law, and it was completely fascinating. It was a week-long seminar listening to these witnesses. They had people from the Nicaraguan Contras show up, and guys who have been renegade CIA agents who have been living in exile for years were allowed to come into the country to testify, and it was really pretty fascinating. And and I learned a lot about the CIA that week, and a lot of what I learned was really not very happy. And I think that started a process of kind of questioning some of the things that I saw around me, and I it led to kind of a reanalysis of some of the things that I've thought all along. But mostly what it did was just kind of open me to the idea of questioning the things that it wasn't particularly revelatory about, say, the federal budget or about the state budget or taxation or anything like that. But I think it did kind of open me to, questioning the things that I saw around me, so that when later I started seeing how tax policy changed, I started being more willing to ask the question of, well, who benefits from this change? And really just following where the answers to those questions led me.
Do you find that news outlets being slanted one way or the other way, that people are just overwhelmed by just an influx of information or misinformation, and that maybe is contributing to this growing sense of general dis-ease among people, not just in this country, but globally? People just sort of have had enough, but can't really pinpoint exactly, what that is.
It's really hard because, what we used to have was a situation where where it was pretty easy to tell who was the voice of authority. And now we don't have that. It's much harder to tell who's the voice of authority. But the downside is that a lot of those voices of authority in the past were wrong, about important things. They were, they were voices of authority, but they were also voices of the establishment. They were voices of conservatism. They were the voices that said things are fine the way they are, that let them stay that way. And so I'm not sure that I mourn the passing of that kind of centralized, easy to identify authority. So I'm not sure I mourn that. But you are completely right that what we've got now isn't so obvious an improvement. We have certainly a lot more voices, but yeah, it's a lot harder to tell which ones know what they're talking about, which ones to trust. And it gets harder to tell still when, like you're saying, that when you have voices that are essentially two completely disparate views of the world. I mean, it is possible to get to get enough news from one source to feel like you're learning as much as you need to know, and yet you're learning nothing that corresponds to what other people see. I mean, I think it's astonishing that there are people in the world. I mean, to be specific, let's talk about President Obama, right? I think it's pretty astonishing that there are people in the world who think that he's lost without a teleprompter, that he is in over his head, that he's an affirmative action baby. I mean, he's, for whatever you think about the policies that he's pursued, and I'm not a fan of all of them, I think he's an impressive individual. He understands how to speak in complete sentences. He knows how to use those sentences to good effect. And the idea that he is somehow a dish rag or is just crazy, it seems to me. But that's a really common view, and you can see it repeated on talk radio and endless kinds of comment streams on websites and all over Fox News. And so, if one of the sources that you're getting is that kind of information, how do you reconcile that with another source of information that is that disagrees with it? I mean, you can run down the list of other issues: climate science, the economy, the taxation, poverty. These are all things where it is possible to get to entirely different views of what's out there. I mean, I have to say that I cleave to what I think of as the good old-fashioned ideals that brought us, the Enlightenment. That it is possible to find some kind of truth out there that's worth believing in, but I don't think that you can find it by just sitting back in your chair and being fed. I think you have to think. You have to look at the stuff that comes at you and kind of be critical about who's telling you what and look around. But I think that you can find good information, but you have to read critically. And that, I think, is something that a lot of people don't really do. Speaking
of President Obama, how would you rate how he's done so far, and what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, there's plenty of... I always have a hard time... making the distinction between what I would like to see done and what can be done. So I think that as a when I look at the problems facing the nation, facing the world, they are problems the problems facing the nation. We pay too much for our military. We are still the leading source of global warming gases. We are actively impoverishing many of our citizens. Our economy is still suffering. All the things that we were talking about with the financial industry before, the financial industry not being punished for its misdeeds. I mean, those are all really important problems. Oh, and not to mention the one overriding them all is that the cost of healthcare is making us all broke. Not just the federal government, but also the state and also all the cities and towns, and not to mention, you and me. I mean, these are all really important problems. And when I look at the policy solutions that have been proposed or been enacted for any of those, I think they're all inadequate. The healthcare bill, okay, great. I'm glad it worked. I'm glad it got passed. But boy, it's going to need a lot of improvement before it actually addresses the problems that need addressing. The military, right? I'm glad we're getting out of Iraq, but how about Afghanistan? How about the fact that we spend more on our military than every other country in the whole world combined? Is there nothing else that we can do that's more that's a better expense of all that money? Global warming seems to have completely slipped off of the agenda entirely, but it's still happening. It's still going to happen. It's going to have tremendous worldwide consequences, and they're going to be really expensive. The economy, I'm really glad that they've started to talk about jobs again instead of getting obsessed about the stupid deficit. So all the policy solutions that are out there, I think they're all inadequate. But I don't believe that it's necessarily his fault that they're inadequate. Some of them I can see how it would have been easier for him to do things better. Certainly the enforcement for of laws that were broken in the financial industry, I don't see how Congress had a real part in slowing that down. But in the other ones, it's Congress that has been the issue. And it's not so much been Congress, it's been Republicans in Congress and the odd Democrat like Kent Conrad and Ben Nelson, who are willing to stand with Republicans to stop important progress from being made.
Well, we will come back after a short break. I'm speaking with political reporter and policy researcher Tom Sgouros. I'm Ann Marie Spatharakis, and we'll be back in just a moment. Thank you for joining us today in the studio. If you're just joining us in the studio today, my guest is Tom Sgouros. Tom, you had talked earlier before the break about making the distinction about what you'd like to see done versus what actually can be done. Can you talk a little more about that?
I'm not expressing deep satisfaction with Obama's performance in the first three years, but I am saying that I'm not sure that it's fair to blame him for for all of the shortcomings. It's certainly fair to blame him for some of them. I think that when we concentrate on blaming him for the shortcomings, we let a lot of important people off the hook, and they deserve a huge amount of the blame for for what doesn't happen to solve these problems. And I don't think it's right to let the Republican Party, Mitch McConnell, said last year that he thought his highest priority was to make sure that Barack Obama was a one-term president. I mean, that I think is a pretty low and scandalous perspective to take on politics. I mean, it has to do with how you conceive politics itself. I mean, I think of politics as the way that we iron out disagreements so that we can all muddle through together, to kind of get through the problems that we face and kind of make peace with our neighbors in a way that helps us muddle through and address the problems that we collectively face. That's what I think politics is about. Other people think politics is about war, that politics is war, and that what's important is to vanquish your opponent and, beat them into some kind of submission so that they will stop bothering you. As a political tactic, I think that's, it's fairly effective. As a way to create peace on earth and a better society, I think it's pretty lousy.
Where do you find your inspiration when you write your columns? Is it through just watching the news and seeing, what kind of makes you go, yeah, that's what I want to write about right now?
It's largely not watching the news. I mean, the way I got into journalism was by noticing years ago that there were a lot of important stories that did not get covered very well or at all. And so the way that I find things to write about is I read reports. I look at, some press release will come out and it'll reference some report. So my favorite thing to do is to ignore the press release and go read the report. And look at the footnotes in it, because you get the greatest stuff in the footnotes. And so that's sort of how I operate. I'm much more interested in finding the subjects that are really important that no one writes about. Like for example, here's one that I wrote about last week. We hear a lot about how our schools are doing, and how they're failing us, and then, God, isn't that terrible? Well, if you actually look at the data, it's not actually that bad. In fact, it's not bad at all. Even Rhode Island compared to the rest of the country, if you look at the NAEP tests, the National Assessment of Educational Progress tests, right? These are sort of the federally administered tests. They're kind of the gold standard of testing. And if you look at how Rhode Island schools do, it's actually not so bad. We have made quite a bit of progress in the past 15 years. Looking at like fourth grade results, which are the best record that we have in Rhode Island, we've made quite a bit of progress for white kids. We've done as good as the national average, slightly better than the national average for them. Black kids have done even a little bit better than that, better than the national average in the progress that they've made in the last 15 or 20 years. Hispanic kids have way outperformed the national average. And in both those categories, we're doing as good or better in terms of the improvement with Massachusetts, and better objectively with Connecticut. I mean, those are pretty remarkable results. And you never hear about that, right? What you hear instead is the idea that our schools are failing and we're putting so much money into it, and what a waste of time and effort and stuff like that. But the actual data that's out there does not actually support that story. And so if you read the news, you don't get that story. If you read the reports, you do get that story. And I think that that's kind of a shame. I mean, to stick on the education one, what you what you learn is that the story is all about inequality. That's what drags down Rhode Island test results. The good schools in Rhode Island are as good as any in the country, and the good schools in this country are as good as any in the world. However, the bad schools are not so good, and they are dragged down by problems of poverty, and they're dragged down by things that happen outside the school. They're dragged down by mobility issues, where people can't even stay in the same school year after year because because their living situation has to change to deal with a job or the loss of a job. There are nutrition issues. There are maintenance issues on the buildings that they're in, and ultimately the poor schools are in the cities where on which we've sort of engaged sort of fiscal warfare over the past 20 years. So when you look at the problem of education, if you really follow the data, you get to a story about inequality, not to a story about failing teachers or failing educational practice.
So do you think the problem in education is bigger than just funding? I know that you said poverty is an issue. So, what's the solution to that?
Well, the solution there is to be honest about what the problems are. If the problems involve, preschool preparation, if the fact is that some kids arrive at age 5 in far better shape to begin their school career than other kids, why don't you spend some time working at that? Spend some time and effort addressing that problem. Well, and that's something that we don't do. We nod at that problem, but there aren't. We could have educators going around to child care centers and trying to make them into more than just warehouses for young kids. We could do that, but we don't. Head Start is not. Head Start gets some credit and gets some support. It's more of a social support thing, though, than an academic thing. There are academic models out there that we could follow, but those cost money, and it's more fun to blame teachers for letting us down than it is to spend time really following and trying to dig up the causes, I guess. That's a little too cynical way to say it. I don't really, but that is the actual effect. That we spend more time complaining about how the schools are failing us than we spend time looking for ways that we could actually address the real problems that they face.
As we start wrapping things up, I'd like to ask whether in life or as a writer or just in general, what's the best advice you've ever gotten?
I don't know if I can encapsulate it into words of advice, but I will say that one thing that both my parents did for me was encourage me to make my own opinions and to be confident in the, to do my homework, but to, once having done my homework, to formulate an opinion and be prepared to defend it, and to feel good about that, even if it turns out that I disagree with everybody else. And I think I'd probably put that there.
It takes a lot of courage to speak unpopular truths.
I don't know if I'd say it that way, but it takes you have to sort of not care as much about the opinion of other people. But that is, I guess, something that they encouraged me in.
Excellent, Tom. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Ann Marie. This has been a pleasure.
Tom Sgouros is a freelance writer, policy researcher, and engineer. You can read Tom's articles on the golocalprov.com website or find him on Facebook. And if you'd like to hear this conversation again, you can go to the Ann Spath Productions Facebook page. Simply click the like button and listen. And of course, feel free also to click that share button if you think you know somebody who might also enjoy it. Next week, former state representative and current president and CEO of the South County Tourism Council, Myrna George, will join us in the studio to talk about the impact China could have on the local economy here in Rhode Island. A big thanks today to our board operator, Lauren Kleinkopf. Thanks so much, Lauren, and everyone at WBLQ. As always, streaming live worldwide, at WBLQ.net. I'm Ann Marie Spatharakis. Thanks so much for joining us today in the studio.